and they leave open a space for postmodern considerations of the subjective nature of truth. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of background information on the sympathetic imagination. For those of you who are at Amory's panel last session, you might have heard all this, but so I'm getting this term sympathetic imagination from J.M. Coetzee's The Lives of Animals. So this is a novel about the fictional novelist, Elizabeth Costello, who is asked to give a talk at Appleton College, and she chooses to give a talk on animals. So at some point in this talk, she's responding to Nagel, who says that we can't imagine ourselves into a bat. But she disagrees with this, and she says we can imagine ourselves into the bat because both the bat and the human are full of being. Okay. She says there's no limit to the extent to which we can think ourselves into the being of another. There's no bounds to the sympathetic imagination. So what Costello is saying is that she can think her way into the existence of a bat or a chimpanzee or an oyster or any being with whom I share the substrate life. So this idea of the sympathetic imagination is pretty consistent, I think, in all of Coetzee's works. I think most notably in his work Disgrace, which I'm not going to get into too much right now, but I think what Coetzee's body of work kind of tells us is that if we're not using this sympathetic imagination, this is going to lead to a sort of lack of understanding about the other, and thus marginalization or oppression, because either there's no consideration being given to the other, or there are sort of wrongful assumptions happening. However, if you are using your sympathetic imagination, then it's going to lead to acts of altruism, kindness, right? So Coetzee never really says anywhere that this is going to lead us to some deeper, true understanding of the other. Kind of the opposite. It says that it's going to lead us to a more full understanding of our own ignorance, which is necessary, actually, in order to sort of avoid those kinds of dangerous assumptions, basically. Okay, so I want to situate the sympathetic imagination in a postmodern tradition. So we'll call it postmodernism, is a reaction to Cartesian modernism with its strict adherence to empirical logic and reason. So this is exactly what Costello's critiquing. She says, this is a long quote, both reason and 7 decades of life experience tell me that reason is neither the being of the universe nor the being of God. On the contrary, reason looks to me suspiciously like the being of human thought. Worse than that, like the being of one tendency in human thought. Reason is the being of a certain spectrum of human thinking. And if this is so, if this is what I believe, then why should I bow to reason this afternoon and content myself with embroidering on the discourses of the old philosophers? So she's responding to philosophers like Descartes and Kant, who believe that universe is built on reason. By critiquing modernism, she's setting up her argument, and she's situating herself in that kind of postmodern tradition. So she's sort of acknowledging that the sympathetic imagination is inherently subjective. So that's drawing from Derrida and Nietzsche, who say that there's no sort of universal kind of way of experiencing the universe. It's very subjective, based on our sort of environmental history, our biological history, because of the elusive sort of nature of language, right? So inevitably, the way we're going to imagine ourselves into an animal or any other being is going to be different. It's going to be subjective. But this idea of the sympathetic imagination, it really takes postmodernism seriously. So I think some of the problems with modernism that needs to be acknowledged. So modernist arguments that sort of accept the status quo. Animals are going to be mistreated, obviously, because they seem to lack reason. Okay, but I kind of want to move away from modernist arguments that accept the status quo and look at modernist arguments that argue for abolition or reform. So problems with that kind of an argument. The animal, if the animal's rights depend upon meeting a certain set of criteria for sentience or for autonomy, then certain animals are not going to make the cut, basically, and they must be researched on in order to obtain that proof necessary to prove their sentience or their autonomy. Okay, so this is a paradox that actually Hal Herzog in his book, Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, he points out. He says there's a paradox associated with this empirical approach to animal rights. You need to conduct animal research to determine if it's immoral to use a species in animal research. Okay, so Herzog, he uses Stephen Weiss's book, Drawing the Line, as an example of this kind of empirical approach. So this is a different text, a different Stephen Weiss text, but he uses a scale for practical autonomy to try to determine empirically prove an animal's potential for autonomy, which he says is kind of the only thing that really matters in cases of law. Ironically, he does rely on emotional appeals as well, which I pointed out at the beginning of my talk. A review of his book, not this one, but Rattling the Cage, by Martha Nussbaum, entitled Animal Rights, The Need for a Theoretical Basis. So she critiques Weiss for having kind of only a shallow, theoretical discussion of animal rights. In her conclusion, she says, this is an area in which we will ultimately need good theories to winnow our judgments, because our judgments are so flawed and shot through with self-serving inconsistencies. But we also need, along the way, good reports of science, good discussions of concrete cases, and sensible proposals for activism. So I think Nussbaum's argument is pretty clearly rooted in this modernist sort of paradigm, which I think is evident when she says that we need good reports of science. This kind of paradigm sort of presupposes that science is going to inevitably lead us to some kind of truth, which postmodernism would kind of say that maybe doesn't really exist. But I don't think that we need any kind of empirical evidence to prove what, our intuition and our empathy and our imagination can sort of just as easily tell us. So I want to talk about now where I think this idea of the sympathetic imagination is joining sort of the conversation of animal rights and animal welfare. So first I want to consider this quote from Coetzee. Such a language is available to me, I know. It is the language of Aristotle, of Porphyry, of Augustine and Aquinas, of Descartes and Bentham, of in our day Mary McGee and Tom Regan. It is the philosophical language in which we can discuss and debate what kind of souls animals have, whether they reason or, on the contrary, act as biological automatons, whether they have rights in respect of us or whether we merely have duties in respect of them. So she's putting utilitarians and proponents of natural rights, as well as arguments for abolition, status quo, reform, all in the same boat. So she goes on to explain that all these philosophers are operating under the assumption that reason is kind of the center of everything, right? So although she doesn't exactly call them this, they're all kind of modernists. So she singles herself out as the sort of only abolitionist, reformist philosopher that is operating under this kind of postmodern paradigm. She says, the question to ask should not be, do we have something in common, reason, self-consciousness, a soul with other animals, with a corollary that if we do not, then we are entitled to treat them as we like, imprisoning them, killing them, dishonoring their corpses. So here she's kind of echoing the language of Bentham, but at the same time she's sort of critiquing him because the utilitarian philosophy sort of depends on reason to prove an animal's ability to suffer. But the sympathetic imagination does not require any kind of empirical proof. It, in fact, kind of rejects it. I don't think exactly that the sympathetic imagination is as far removed from these kind of modernist theories as Costello might suggest. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with asking the question of suffering or autonomy. I think, in fact, it's actually necessary to ask those kinds of questions in order to use the sympathetic imagination. But it leaves open multiple kinds of answers, possible interpretations. It doesn't require any definitive answer. I want to point out that Coetzee plants naysayers directly into the lives of animals in the form of Costello's daughter-in-law, Norma, and in some of the scholars that are present at her talk. Norma, the daughter-in-law, believes that Costello's opinions on animals, animal consciousness, and ethical relations with animals are jejune and sentimental. So why, I want to know, is sentimentalism something that is so often condemned? I think probably